Every single culture, every single race has blood on its hands from its own history. Good morning. I am deeply concerned about the quality of the conversation about race relations in the United States and globally. Deeply concerned because I feel it has become so divisive that we are doing serious damage to a lot of progress that has been made in my lifetime. I actually feel that we have regressed some, particularly, I think, since the advent of social media. I think social media, for all of the good that it has done in terms of making the world a smaller place and allowing us to connect to one another in a way that really was never possible like that before. Part of the mechanism that enables that are these algorithms that create echo chambers where if you believe a certain thing and you discuss a certain thing, the algorithm knows what you like to discuss and what you believe and feeds you more of that kind of content to reinforce your beliefs. Now, sometimes you're right, your beliefs are accurate. They're based on fact. They're based on truth. Good. Those are ideas worth spreading. When ideas are not factual and they aren't based on truth, then this amplification in this echo chamber is terrible. It's toxic. And it has led to a lot of social ills that I've observed. Young girls, one of the things that it does is it gives ideas velocity in ways that were not possible before. In years before social media, ideas circulated on TV. The news came on at 7 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock at night, right? The national news, you had your local news at 6. And everyone kind of gathered around and caught up on what was going on in the world, right? And you had it once or twice a day. Newspapers were once or twice a day. And so the pace of information and the velocity of information as ideas were circulating into the culture was, I can't call it slow because this is a very relative thing, but it was slower than it is now. And it is now morphed into something that is so fast and ideas are spread so quickly, good and bad ones, that it makes our heads spin. And we don't even know what we're doing to ourselves. We are not zoomed out enough to the reality of what's going on, this technically enabled dysfunction that we are just swimming in. We haven't zoomed out and acknowledged to ourselves that maybe the world isn't as fucked up as I think it is based on everything I hear and see on social media every day. Maybe it's just really noisy discussion about a relatively small incidence of these bad behaviors that are amplified and discussed in a way that make it look like it's happening everywhere at all times, 24/7. Please understand that we are in a matrix of our own design, and it does impact the way we think, the way we talk, the way we feel, and the way we relate. And if you can't take a time out and understand this bigger context that we are existing in, and you instead just want to believe that everything you hear and see is true, then we're really going to have some big problems because we're not dealing with reality. Now, one of the things that has been propagated, and I want to use this as an object lesson, one of the ideas that has been propagated over the past I don't know, it's hard to say. 10 years. And probably longer. Is that white people are a uniquely evil presence in the world. That when you look at the history of atrocities that white people have done over time, that it supports this idea that white people are just some evil MFers, all right? Everywhere they go, they're just causing problems, right? So that now, most of this point of view is expressed. I see it mostly on YouTube, mostly coming from people of color who are in the woke community in particular. And I do not suggest that most people of color hold these beliefs, but if you repeat a lie often enough, it'll get traction. And I do believe that we do have a big floating fart in culture now that everyone seems to want to, let me call it a fart-inflated beach ball that everyone wants to play with. White people are evil. Look at slavery. Look at colonialism. Look at all these things that white people have done historically. There's your facts. It's facts. I've got other facts, and I want you to consider them, please. I'm a humanist. I love people. I am called to love all people. And we are, as a human species, one. And the idea that the color of one's skin creates a separate kind of human. And if you just listened to the conversation today, you probably would say it doesn't exist. I mean, these white people do this. And the height of irony, and I'll get this started, was a young Asian woman who was playing with the fart ball, the fart-filled beach ball, and talking about white people and how evil white people are. Well, I know a little bit of history, not a lot, but I also have the internet and I have AI. So finding out the answers to many of these things is not that complicated. All right. Let's start with the Asian, since my little Asian friend was so vocal about the white record historically. Under Genghis Khan, some say Genghis Khan. I recently heard someone say it was Genghis Khan. All right. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol conquests in the 13th century, where they went from Asia and swept across Europe, particularly Northern Europe. The Mongol conquests in the 13th century resulted in the deaths of an estimated 30 to 40 million people across Eurasia through massacres, destruction, and famine. The Mongol conquest resulted in the deaths of 30 to 40 million people. Next, let's give the white people some. Under the Nazi regime, Germans perpetrated the Holocaust of World War II, killing Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, disabled people, Slavs, Roma. 6 million people. In Africa, And there are a lot of examples here as well, my brothers and sisters. In the Rwandan genocide of 1994, members of the Hutu ethnic minority murdered an estimated 800,000 to 1 million people, mostly of the Tutsi minority, in just 10 days. Blacks killing blacks. Tribal affiliated driven conflict. 10 days. 800,000 to 1 million people in 10 days. The Japanese. During World War II, the Japanese military committed widespread atrocities and war crimes, including the Nanking Massacre, the rape of Nanking, where an estimated 40 to 300,000 Chinese were killed in brutality against POWs and civilians across Asia. Do these numbers just bounce off of you? Because this shit's almost bringing me to tears. Man's inhumanity to man. I want you to think about each of these lives as a real life, as rich as yours. They loved their mother. They loved their father like you loved yours. They loved their brother and their sister like you loved yours. They ate, they cried, they shat, they peed, they loved, they suffered just like you do. Don't let these numbers fool you. Those are lives, real, rich lives, just like yours. And just because it happened hundreds of years ago does not diminish the atrocity. The Ottoman Turks, in the Armenian genocide of 1914 to 1923, the Ottoman government killed an estimated 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians in a systematic campaign of deportations and massacres. The Khmer Rouge, under the communist Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million people, a quarter of Cambodia's population, died from execution, starvation, and forced labor. History is, and I have only scratched the surface. Every single one of us as humans in our cultures, our races, our ethnicities has blood on our hands. The human species is a species capable of extraordinary beauty and grace, but also wickedness and evil. Every single one of you and me. And so to pick one particular group to say that it exceeds across all of history, it exceeds the damage, the evil of everyone else is bullshit. You're either operating within fact or you're operating within illusion, with an agenda to just win an argument no matter what. If you make up lies, you make up lies. I welcome anyone to come and discuss this with me. If my numbers are wrong, Give me better numbers. All right. If I had the stomach for it, and it really is really gut-wrenching work to me to go through and do this research, I could find more examples than I have interest in recording. It would be really ugly. I just read, and the idea that the South, that Americans, white Americans, and look, slavery is a stain and a scar on the soul of this continent, okay? But all these other things are scars on the souls of those continents and those cultures as well. All right? You have your own reckoning, your own moral reckoning to wrestle with. And when you start pointing fingers at other cultures, the subtext is that we are superior. That we wouldn't do that. We Asians wouldn't do that thing that these white people do. These black people, we black people, we wouldn't do that thing that white people do. That's a white people thing. Yeah? No, we're not. We're better than that. No, you're not. None of us are better than that. We're all guilty. As a race, as a human race. Some other things before I jump off. Because again, I think context is important. I think numbers help give us a sense of the scale. Okay, I've shared some numbers, and those are huge numbers. Oh, God. 30 to 40 million people under Genghis Khan? Are you fucking kidding me? Those are entire country populations. There are multiple countries that could be added up to have that. That's just unbelievable. Who talks about that? Who talks about these other things? All right. The transatlantic slave trade involved, I believe, about 17 million slaves. Almost all of them from Africa. The vast majority of those slaves went to South America. If you look at a map, you see that Africa and South America are actually not far away from one another, particularly Brazil. There was a huge slave trade with South America, and particularly in Brazil. Many of the slaves that were sold into slavery in Brazil were enslaved by Europeans people of European extraction, but there were also a lot of black slave owners there, and slave ownership has a long history in Brazil that preceded the transatlantic slave trade. Humans have been enslaving one another since the dawn of time. There is nothing special about what happened in America. That is just another chapter in a very sordid chapter of human history where people have enslaved others. And there is nothing more uniquely terrible about the American slave trade than there was about anything else other than its scale and efficiency, which were artifacts of the technology and the cultural practices at the time. They were good at it, so they were able to scale it and make it happen in the way that it did. So 17 million people, you had boats, navigational technology, boats that were built to go across oceans in ways that they hadn't been able to before and carry large cargoes of food and obviously humans. Oh, God. 17 million people. Do you know how many of those ended up in the United States? Let me check here. Transatlantic slavery, total slaves. You ever do this? About 12 million slaves were enslaved between 1640 and 1807. All right. Of those 12 million, do you know how many landed in the United States? We actually have records. 388,000 Africans were brought to the United States and were enslaved. 388,000. That's a much smaller number than I thought. During that exact same period, I should say roughly during that same period, in Africa, the Dahomey tribe. Recently, there was a movie made about the Dahomeys. The Dahomey tribes were doing human sacrifice of their own people. There are lots of explanations, but take it how you want. The facts are, and this has been substantiated with African historical accounts as well as European accounts, the captives from war and criminals were killed for the deceased kings of Dahomey. They would often sacrifice these Africans, cut their heads off, and lay them in the bottom of the grave and put the king on top, bury the king on top of them. During the ceremony, about 500 prisoners would be sacrificed. I have seen numbers that suggest that over the course of time, roughly in the period when the Dahomey were at their influence during the transatlantic slave trade. This is independent of that trade, I believe. No, actually, now that I go back and remember, the Dahomey were one of the principal participants in the African slave trade because they were so damn good at raiding other villages and other tribes and capturing them and then selling them to the Europeans. This was slave trade and capture was really one of the Dahomey's, strengths. They were renowned for it in Africa. Okay. So the numbers that I saw suggested that up to 250,000 people were sacrificed in this way. 250,000 heads were chopped off. Does it matter that they weren't chopped off by white people? Would it make it worse that those heads were chopped off by white people? Or is it sufficient to say that chopping one human being, chopping off another human being's head is just not a good thing, regardless of the skin color? There are many other atrocities that can be documented. During the time of the transatlantic slave trade, when 388,000 Africans were shipped from their homeland to the United States, at the same time, around the Mediterranean, the Barbary pirates captured over 1 million Europeans and enslaved them. Do you know where the Barbary coast is? That's northern Africa. Now, the Barbary pirates were not all black Africans. There were, it was a combination of different ethnicities, but they were all darker skinned, and they were all collectively, they were capturing white people, and over 1 million were enslaved during the same time that the Atlantic slave trade happened. Prior to that, Arabs and Muslims had a habit of gathering slaves from the Slavic countries and bringing them down to the Middle East. Slavs, slaves. This is just the beginning of a much longer extended conversation, but I just wanted to lay out some basic numbers. There's no moral high ground for any race to stand on. You just don't have the legs. If you go and do the numbers, and you're not going into it with an agenda to win, but you just want to understand and you want to have the facts. All right, you just want to have the facts. Go do some research. Tell me if the stuff I've said here is made up. I'm probably using the same internet that you are. So either the internet is wrong, and that's very possible, and if that's the fact, please correct me. I don't like walking around spouting bad information. I think it's intellectually indefensible to do that. All right. Till we meet again, my friends. Peace.